Welcome back. This is part 2 of the retrospective into Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. If you haven't watched part 1, then please go do so now. As always, disclaimer, this is a deep dive into elements of the Legacy of Kain series, so there will be spoilers. Also, like part 1, I've left timestamps in the description for navigation. Last we left off, Kain had just finished his battle against Malik, his unsuccessful battle against Malik, and was now bound for the caves of the Oracle of Nosgoth, hoping the old soothsayer would have some insight into how to defeat the Eternal Paladin. The caves of the Oracle are the next step in difficulty, and something of a prelude to what will be very common in the section coming right after. Malik's Bastion had challenges without a hint of blood nearby, and now the next step is living enemies, but with tainted blood, which poisons Kain, slowly draining his HP, but eventually going away on its own, though using the antitoxin item is preferred. Life and blood are precious, and the poison can severely drain those. Before reaching the Oracle, there is a room with a small museum of artifacts from Nosgoth's history, or more precisely, timelines. These for the most part represent the journey ahead of you, serving as delightful bits of foreshadowing. A piece of brand new Seraphim armor for Malik, your quarry, a bloodied shield for Willendorf from the battle against the Nemesis, a still bloodied guillotine for Vorador, and both the shield and banner of Moebius' mercenary army, all of them a consequence of Kain's trip to the past. Lastly, Elzevir's doll, which is the key to obtaining King Ottmar's armies. The Silicon Knights team really enjoy putting in references and foreshadowing in the game, and I'm all for it. I did say these are all references for the most part, because there's also a book which states the Circle created the Seraphim, with its members trained to be loyal to the Guardians, providing the connecting thread for the player. That explains why Vorador went after the Circle in the game's opening scenes, before the vampire himself tells it outright later on. With the Seraphim exterminating vampires left and right, Vorador went for the head of the snake, the leadership behind the Sorcerer Priests. Kain's first meeting with the Guardian of the Pillar of Time, Moebius, is in his guise with a very helpful Oracle of Nosgoth, a popular soothsayer, though considering the degree of danger Kain faces on the way to him, I wonder how the regular people of Nosgoth managed it. With that said, I wouldn't put it past Moebius to set these challenges in front of Kain on purpose, or that he put them there after the corruption of the Pillars. That character profile page that Silicon Knights published, part of their Everything About Blood Omen guide, mentioned that he was once a helpful figure, giving out kind predictions, and only since the corruption did he become malicious in intent. Kain has one thing in mind, only one track in his head. He needs information on Malik and how to defeat him. But before getting to that, the Oracle speaks to him of something else, a piece of critical information that Kain doesn't want or need. First, the marching armies of the Nemesis, and second, the situation in Willendorf, with King Ottmar paralyzed into inaction from worry, his daughter suffering from a strange condition, leaving her in a coma. As for the Paladin, Moebius recounts the events from the intro, claiming Malik's vanity is the reason for Vorador's success in his assassination of the previous members of the Circle, and that since his binding to the armor, he's not allowed a member of the Circle to fall. Which is thoroughly incorrect. And not just because of Napropter, who dismissed the bodyguard, but also Ariel. Then again, her death was at the hand of a traitor in their midst, so maybe we can cut Malik some slack on that one. Kain shifts his attention to Vorador, and the Oracle points him to the Termagant Forest before vanishing, leaving Kain alone in the Oracle chambers. For what is primarily just dramatic effect, in his instructions, Moebius states that the Ignis Fatuus will serve as Kain's guide to Vorador's mansion, and when Kain asks what those are, the time stream states that Ignis Fatuus mark the road to hell. In truth, Ignis Fatuus is just another name for will-o-wisps, ghost lights, and the Latin really just translates to fool's flames. I'll go a bit further for extra nerdy points, and say that Ignis Fatuus is a term invented by a German humanist in the 16th century with the express purpose of sounding intellectual, or in this case, dramatic. The journey to Vorador's mansion is filled with danger. It's, in fact, the most dangerous area in the entire game, at least in terms of environmental damage, given that the Termogen Forest is really a giant swamp, meaning a whole lot of water, which is incredibly damaging to vampires. Fortunately, the path is littered with dungeons and caverns with upgrades, including the final shapeshift, Mist Form. It allows you to go through certain obstacles, traps, and most importantly, go over water without taking damage. Only downside is that it's a mana hog, and bolts of energy can still damage you, and with a swamp filled with sorcerers, well, you get the gist. In my own playthrough, this was yet another area of let's see how many hearts it takes to reach the destination. Back in our first episode of the retrospective, I mentioned that at some point the kitty wheels come off and the game is telling you to make sure to not miss anything important. Well, Vorador's mansion is where this comes into play. This is where you find out if you messed up. In my latest playthrough, gathering footage for this video, I went into Vorador's mansion and realized I missed the power in Korhagen. Let's just say if I hadn't learned the lesson before, I learned it then. As for the manor itself, it is fortified in a way that only a vampire could cross, as it requires certain abilities. Having said so, the interiors are lavish, decadent even, but untouched. Not a single painting missing, not a gold panel removed. All of it a testament to the fearsome reputation of the vampire Vorador and his host of vampiric servants, all of them bound to his will. But it's not just the facade, the coat of paint, that is indulgent, but also the fact there are rooms dedicated to bleeding humans to prepare feasts from them. This is a vampire's domain, and he has full control over it. Kain finds Vorador enjoying a drink in his dining room, and thinks the ancient vampire a vision of his future as a vampire. But to the player, something else is clear. Vorador might be in full control of his domain. It might be impenetrable, but the ancient vampire is not really living it up. He's languishing here, separate from the world, keeping away from all events, just indulging in his hunger and with not much else going on. He boasts of his assault to the Circle and vanquishing Malik, but it's him that's locked up in his sanctuary, while his ancient enemy is still out there. Hell, while the cattle, as he calls humanity, spreads far and wide. Still, he takes a liking to Kain, and offers a ring which will summon him to Kain's side should he need it, but not before telling the young vampire to abandon his quest, that nothing good can come from meddling in the affairs of mortals. And unfortunately for him, he's right, he just doesn't know it yet. Vorador is also the first to instill in Kain the notion that vampirism is not a curse, and the first to openly welcome him, offering him a drink of the blood collected from a dangling victim. In a world where everyone is against him and others are out to manipulate him, Vorador stands as perhaps the one true ally Kain has, someone worried that Kain might meet his end if he continues on his path. Not only that, but this scene marks the first time Kain realizes his current existence is not the punishment he thought, and even agrees with Vorador's claims that mortals offer up the prayers to vampires for power, as if they're gods.
Gift? Vorador thought my curse a blessing, that we were gods, that mortals offered their blood as sacrifice so that we could enjoy our supernatural powers. And somewhere, deep inside my new self, I knew he was right, that mortal dreams were prayers, prayers to us, begging us for power. I pondered this as the decadent old fool prattled on about his past.
This will become very important towards the end of the game, but with a ring in hand and Vorador's backing secured, nothing could stop Kain from pursuing Malik, and the easiest way to do so was to target members of the Circle, in this case, the Triumvirate of Dark Eden, dedicated to twisting and reshaping nature around their dark tower, surrounded by a magical field that kills anything that crosses it. Fortunately for Kain, he's already dead.
The Oracle Caves had the first mutants, but here Kain finds them in abundance, along with regular mortal enemies, and once again there are victims tied to the walls. Of course there are. The big challenge now is that Kain has several spells that allow him to draw blood from a distance, or even from every enemy on screen. Though if you do use them in this chapter of the story, it's very likely that you'll draw in the poisonous blood of the mutants as well. The triumvirate of the Jewel the Energist, Bane the Druid, and Anarkroth the Alchemist is supposedly attempting to create new nature, but in the game this is only manifest in the mutant enemies and in the plant obstacles that fire thorns and poisonous gas in your direction. The land itself is blasted and burned around the tower, with pockets of magma and whatever towns that have been there crumbled into ruin. So in addition to highly aggressive flora and fauna, it's unclear how far they would have gone in their perversion of nature. Having said this, the journey to the Dark Tower is, after the swamp, the most perilous. It's poison and fire everywhere you go. Dark Eden is something of a mix between Malek's Bastion and Napraptor's Retreat in terms of the abundance of enemies and traps. It's a rather challenging location, made much more dangerous by the presence of the mutants and their toxic blood. Having said so, it's fairly linear. The real meat of Dark Eden is the encounter with its leaders. Upon reaching their chambers, Kain finds the Jewel, Bane, Anarkroth, and of course Malek, voiced by Anna Gunn, Paul Lukather, Richard Doyle, and Neil Ross respectively. In the previous episode I mentioned Richard Doyle played multiple characters, and this is true for most of the actors in the game, save for Simon Templeman who only voiced Kain. Anna Gunn plays Ariel, the Jewel, and Azimuth, Paul Lukather is Bane and Vorador, Richard Doyle is Anarkroth, Napraptor, and Moebius. And you gotta give mad props to these people. Generally speaking, it's really difficult to notice that it's the same actor playing them. They sound so different. The only exception is Tony J because, well, it's Tony J. His voice is very unique. But back in Dark Eden, the Alchemist escapes and Vorador appears for his final battle against the Paladin, leaving Kain to defeat the Guardians of the Pillars of Energy and Nature, and which represent a significant spike in boss difficulty. Bane moves throughout the battlefield, turning tiles from earth to water, reducing the number of safe spaces and dealing damage on contact, while the Jewel spams energy bolts like there's no tomorrow. In the Blood Omen character profile page, it stated that the Jewel's energy radiated from her, potentially harming those around her, which is why she wore a lead outfit to keep those around her safe. And in the scene before the battle, she can be seen in that attire. During the battle though, she's without it and her skin glows blue, which is a nice touch. Bane, on the other hand, is a stereotyped fantasy druid, including the reindeer horn headdress, and that's about as much as I can say about them. Unfortunately, the Triumvirate of Dark Eden are the least interesting characters in Blood Omen, by virtue of not having enough screen time or even that much going on. We don't know anything about them, we never hear of them, or see anything that could inform us on who they are as people. They're just an obstacle in your path, people to kill, and that's all. Inevitably, the Guardians fall, and Kain retrieves the relics, Bane's horned headdress and the Jewel's suit, and then picks up Malek's discarded helmet, his own relic, and returns them to the pillars, restoring them. Immediately after, Ariel points Kain to the next target, Azimuth the Planer, the Guardian of the Pillar of Dimension and ruler of the city of Avernus. Ariel mentions 3 instruments will be found there, items that will be helpful to Kain, and then cryptically say that Kain would have to fall, rise, and find himself in between. Avernus' design from arrival to exploration always felt to me like the final exam on things the game has thrown at you so far. First, much like Malek's Bastion, you can't arrive on foot. You need to find the vantage point and then fly into the city. And then, much like Korhagen, you have a destroyed and ruined place with mirrored houses, interconnected tunnels, and very dangerous streets. But unlike Kain's home, the enemies in Avernus start out typical. Some guards and citizens, even some sorcerers and spirits in the sewers, but afterwards demons take their place. And in case anyone is wondering, yeah, it's the same demons we see redesigned in Soul Reaver 2, like the lightning, acid, poison, and red demons, each of them more dangerous than the next, some of them having poisonous blood, and at least visually similar to the Dark Entity. Eventually, Kain finds his way into Avernus Cathedral, and it's at this point that it reminds you of Ariel's words. You will rise, fall, and find yourself in between, or something like that. This is another bit of cryptic foreshadowing, as Avernus is divided into 3 distinct sections. There's the ground floor, the cathedral itself, where Azimuth lies in wait, the seat of her power. Avernus is a theocracy, ruled by Azimuth, thus the temple is her office, so to speak. Then there are two areas dubbed Heaven and Hell. The Hell section takes Kain to the bowels of the catacombs beneath the cathedral, crudely constructed with rocks and bones. It's where Kain obtains a new piece of gear, a suit of armor that faces the wearer in and out of the material world, so that all damage is equally split between mana and health. This is the first of the 3 instruments mentioned by Ariel. In Hell, Kain also finds the altar to Hash-Akik, with an image carved on the floor that is your first glimpse of the final boss of the game, the dark entity possessing Mortanius. The Heaven section is a maze, almost made to look like white marble and with glittering surfaces, with small platforms connected by portals. By making his path through them, sometimes going in circles, and yes, I always end up going in circles, eventually Kain reaches a room that seems like it has a glass floor with Nosgoth stretching out below. If this is really an area floating in the sky, it's unclear. But there's one very important item here, the Soul Reaver, the second instrument. In Blood Omen, much like its other weapons, the Reaver has its own unique mechanics. Most things struck by the blade are immediately destroyed, except some bosses, at the cost of Kain's entire pool of mana. Even using the mana battery item, which is meant to supply endless mana for a time, the blade consumes the meter entirely. I can't say I like this design. It's actually incredibly annoying, and makes use of the Reaver very much in case of heartbit break glass. Something you save for a challenging encounter, instead of something that makes you feel like you're more powerful, something the other weapons achieve. Even the spiked mace, which doesn't kill, makes you feel really good when you stun 4 enemies in a row and drain them in one go. Yet the Reaver is very much swing, kill, wait, or use item, slash, and wait. It's not the most satisfying experience, especially with those bosses that take more than one hit of the blade's die. It can get up to a bit of a slog, or just spending mana bank items like crazy. Kain eventually confronts Azimuth, who is surprised to see Kain wielding the Reaver and having the armor found in the Hell section, not aware that they were there. Azimuth's fight has her throwing projectiles and summoning hordes of demons, but even she can't withstand the might of the Soul Reaver and is decimated in one blow, leaving her eye, the relic that connected her to the pillar, and the third instrument mentioned by Ariel, a time streaming device, which is a key item for the next section of the story, and which, as Ariel will put it, will deliver Kain in time. She says Azimuth stole the device from Moebius, using it to add creatures from other times to her already swelling host of summoned demons. This is the first time Moebius' name is brought up in dialogue. Ariel's next instructions is not on a member of the Circle, which is strange, but on the marching armies of the Nemesis, once called William the Just, until his armies and his own power grew enough that he became the monster he is now. Only Willendorf and its armies have any hope of stopping him, and Ariel urges Kain to rally the forces for that battle, or as she says, all will be lost. With no other options available, and Ariel seemingly shifting gears to this threat instead of the pursuit of the members of the Circle, Kain makes for Willendorf. It might seem suspicious that Ariel focuses on the Nemesis, but it's worth remembering 2 important facts. The first is she's the only uncorrupted member of the Circle. Her death spared her that fate. And second, she's a very recent ghost. She's yet to spend the centuries drowning in her own bitterness. So Ariel still serves Nosgoth, and genuinely sees the Nemesis as a real threat. In other words, she's the closest to a genuinely good person in this entire story. If you ignore the part where she doesn't tell Kain he needs to die as well as the new Balance Guardian, something she knows very well. If you ignore that bit, the blatant manipulation, then yes, she's a really good person. But the end of the journey is nigh, and Mortanius knows it, so he contacts Kain and tells him from now on, his quest is his own, and the Necromancer can't help him any longer. Not that he ever actually helped in any way. At best, he offered some quips. Not like he fought enemies alongside Kain or provided gears and spells. It's a moment that will make many players laugh, wondering, help? With what? To meet King Ottmar, Kain's facade as a commoner will not suffice. Fortunately, there is a fountain on his path that upgrades the false image to that of a nobleman, really just allowing everyone to see Kain for who he was in life. With it, Kain enters the court and finds Ottmar sitting on the throne. yet another ruler languishing, though in Ottmar's case, it's worry and anguish that holds his heart. As the oracle mentioned, Ottmar's daughter is suffering from a malaise, that being she's lost her soul. Ottmar made a contest for who would create the best doll in the land, and Elzevir the dollmaker won, earning a royal favor, for which the dollmaker only asked for a lock of the princess's hair, which, though creepy as hell, must have seemed harmless, until he used it to steal the princess's soul and bind it to a doll. But the exact reasons for this, what he planned for the puppet, that is never explained, and something tells me it's better that way, you know? Some stuff you just don't need to know. I hate Elzevir, I just have to say it. I hate the character, I hate his dungeon, and most importantly, I despise the music in his dungeon. It's horrible, it's grating like circus music from hell, and if that was the intent, I applaud them. In any case, Elzevir's workshop is surrounded and inhabited by his living dolls. How these dolls came to animate is a good question. It can be simple magic, or if the princess is any indication, this might not be the first time Elzevir has bound a human soul to a puppet. In terms of gameplay, the workshop is similar to Malek's Bastion, a dungeon filled with traps and bloodless enemies, though significantly smaller and with the usual array of chained victims on the walls, proving that binding people in chains on walls and leaving them there for future use is the norm in Nosgoth, at least for monsters and psychopaths. It's how they aged them for that special vintage. Confronting Elzevir, he acts like a spoiled child, claiming the princess is his and we won't take her away, and in the fight he's barely a threat. And Kain takes the soul-bound puppet back to Ottmar, who grants him use of his armies for the battle of the last stand against the Nemesis. Only it's not much of a fight. It's not much of a battle. It's a massacre. The forces of the Nemesis destroy Ottmar's armies and kill the king as well. In this battlefield, Kain gorges on the blood of enemy and ally alike, or so Kain tells the player. Though if they actually do it or not, it's up to the player. In my own playthrough, I just ran past the entire conflict in Big Doggo form. Nevertheless, upon reaching the other side, the time streaming device kicks in, sending Kain hurtling back to the time prior to William the Just Stern to the Nemesis. Kain has but one hope, to slay the young king before he can become a tyrant, because that surely won't have any negative repercussions, right? Then again, prior to this moment, the consequences of time travel, paradoxes, or any of those mechanics and concepts are not even mentioned once, so there is no way for the character to even have an inkling of how badly he may be screwing things up. Upon arrival, Kain confronts a guard, and through his mind he witnesses the Oracle, Moebius, giving a speech to the townsfolk inciting them to anger against an unspecified evil that will destroy their crops, their homes, their very lives, and demanding they take him to see the king so that he can be prepared against it. According to the cinematics guide that Silicon Knights provided to the composer, mentioning details about them and their overall themes, this cutscene has a strong theme of fascism, pomp and circumstance, similar, they said, to the Nuremberg rallies, with Moebius acting the part of Hitler inciting the crowd. And though it's only mentioned for this cutscene, the same theme is very much present in the cutscene after Kain's return from the past, in which Time Streamer's fervor reaches a fever pitch right before the start of his boss fight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Kain makes his way through the countryside and into William's castle, where after evading or confronting his soldiers, he finds himself overlooking a room where William and Moebius are speaking, and you have to admire the voice direction given to the cast. William, in this time, is still a young man, very innocent, and you notice it in how timid his voice sounds. He stutters even, but he's not a complete fool. He doubts Moebius, and instead of confidently spewing vitriol, as Kain had seen Moebius do in the memory, here he speaks humbly, almost in a submissive tone, enough to convince the young king of his pure intentions in giving him the weapons and the knowledge that a vampire assassin is coming for him. Before moving on, I do have to say it's kind of funny that William's soldiers look identical to the way they looked as the Nemesis soldiers, proving that, good or bad, the guy had a thing for spiky red armor. And speaking of armaments, and based on the conversation between Moebius and William, We can assume two things. One, Moebius delivered armaments in general to William, and the second is that while it's not specifically mentioned, it's also safe to assume that Moebius delivered the Soul Reaver to him. And if we couple that with Azimuth's surprise in the Soul Reaver being in Avernus, given that that's her seat of power, then it's not much of a leap to conclude that Kain found the Reaver there because Moebius left it there for him to find. It's not set out right in the game or in any of the guides' interviews, but even in Blood Omen, the meeting of the two Soul Reavers from different times is important. Remember, I'm looking at this from just the point of view of Blood Omen, and of the many concepts the game introduces and toys with up to this point, paradoxes are not one of them. And speaking of time, one thing that is revealed a bit later is that Moebius is responsible for turning William the Just into the Nemesis, which means this plan includes a 50-year process of turning a benevolent king into a bloodthirsty ruler. That's some planning. But it is worth mentioning that aside from Mortanius, who's dabbled with the mechanics of life and death through his necromancy for centuries, and Malik, who was imprisoned in his armor, nothing in the game suggests that Moebius is as old as they are. The concept of the pillars sustaining their guardians, granting them longevity, is nowhere in Blood Omen. So for all we know, in Blood Omen, Moebius is just a very old man, but not an ancient guardian or anything, and given Kain's dialogue when killing Moebius, the assumption is that Moebius traveled in time to perform the changes in the past, instead of just being always aware of it. Remember that for Blood Omen, it's assumed that all guardians, though shifty, were generally benevolent before the corruption of the pillars, which means that Moebius's plot only came into being 30 years leading up to the game's events. But back to the story. The young king and Kain do meet in battle, and it's one hell of a hard fight, given that William is also rocking a Reaver. But in the end, Kain shatters the young king's sword and takes his life, at which point he's thrust back to the present to see the consequences of his actions. With the young king dead, the hatred of the populace turned towards the vampires and gave rise to Moebius' mercenary army, whose shield and banner Kain saw in the Oracle Museum. And they have their biggest prize, Vorador, who swiftly decapitated using the guillotine, also in the museum. And then, much like the cutscene of the past, Moebius whips the people into a frenzy against the last surviving vampire, Kain. The fight against Moebius involves normal enemies, his hunters, and given how much power the player has accumulated between weapons, spells, and items, they're cakewalk. At the end of each encounter, Moebius disappears and the player has to pursue him into another room, until the last one where he summons more people from across time, including a future version of Kain, which is really difficult. And if there's ever a remake of Blood Omen, I just want to see this future Kain model replaced by the Soul Reaver Kain, just because it would be cool as hell. With all summoned adversaries defeated, Kain faces Moebius himself, and we see his death in a cinematic, where the time streamer says he's seen Kain's future, and that in it Kain dies, to which our protagonist retorts, "But I am dead," which is one hell of a one-liner given the situation. One thing to note is that when the boss encounter begins, Kain realizes the Oracle is Moebius and that he had betrayed him, like just then, not before, when he heard Moebius warn William of his coming or inciting his subjects. It was this moment. I suppose Kain just follows the old Ian Fleming line from Goldfinger of once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times it's enemy action. In that guide for themes and cinematics, the vision of Moebius' speech, you know, the fascist one, had in the description that it was there that Kain realized the Oracle had betrayed him. But in the final product, the revelation comes, frankly, too late. But with Moebius dead, Kain receives a final summons to the pillars from Mortanius. Before I move to the finale, one thing that is just outright phenomenal is the theming on the different story dungeons, particularly how well they relate to the boss of the area. Malik's Bastion is cold and deadly, not a single drop of blood in sight and not a single person around, very much like the man himself trapped in his armor. Dark Eden is full of laboratories and places for their horrible creations to wander, like its dark fantasy umbrella corporation. Azimuth's entire deal is the exploration of different worlds, so her dungeon has 3 different realms to explore and so on. With every story dungeon, you can easily see how it relates to the character and the story being told as wonderful bits of visual storytelling. Now then, the finale. Kain flies to the pillars and arrives just in time to see a confrontation between Anarkroth and the Necromancer, in which it's revealed that Mortanius is in fact the person responsible for Kain's murder, just so he could raise him for the express purpose of purging the Circle. Not only that, but it shows how most of the Guardians have shifted in thinking, as Anarkroth states defiantly that it's not they who serve the pillars, but the opposite, that the pillars belong to them, and with it they are like gods. Anarkroth and Mortanius decide talking time is over, and go at it, and it's immediately apparent how outclassed the alchemist is, as Mortanius is 1. Immune to his abilities, and 2. Swiftly disposes of him, slamming him against the pillar and then summoning shades that snap his spine. Now here's an interesting thing. Anarkroth's character bio said that once upon a time an accident in the laboratory left one side of his face severely burned. And if you look at his face closely in the cinematic, you can see that that is indeed the case. It speaks to the dedication to include such a small detail when the alchemist's face is only seen for a couple of seconds. With the alchemist's death, Kain emerges from the shadows and confronts his maker, claiming he admires the cunning Mortanius showed, but that he would not escape his fate, to which Mortanius says he'll embrace it, but that his death will leave one more, which when you hear it, and then face the dark entity Hashagik right after, you might think the comment refers to this creature, the Unspoken. But the dark entity is not a member of the Circle, so it's about Kain, of course. I've always found this line to be a very clever bit of foreshadowing right before the end. At this point in the game between zombies, summoners, and necromancers, the player is well versed in fighting against them, and Mortanius is just another one. Curiously, though he's supposedly alive, and that his deathly appearance is a result of his necromancy for centuries, again, something not in the game but in Silicon Knight's Guide on Blood Omen, Mortanius, when struck by a blade, bleeds black like zombies do. And remember that message from Mortanius I mentioned, where he says Kain is now on his own? In that same message he says,
"Strange, isn't it, Kain, that one cannot quite accept that which sustains him. You in your death, and me in mine."
That always made me think that maybe he's also an undead. But then I realized it was likely more the knowledge that he was to die at the end of this journey, and that's what sustains him, the hope that his plan will come to fruition. At least that's what I think. When the Necromancer falls, the Unspoken is revealed, and he mocks Kain for being a pawn in his game, with the vampire of course denying to serve anyone. Hashagik then says the murder of Ariel and the consequences were but the first act in his theater of Grand Guignol, which is such an overt meta-reference, it doesn't really make sense. The Grand Guignol was a theater in Paris between the end of the 19th century to about 1967 that specialized in what we know today as splatter horror, aka very gory and graphic entertainment. In fact, Grand Guignol became the term used for that kind of play. So Hashagik just dropping that term and Kain getting it is just such a weird writing choice. I suppose it's meant to sound imposing or dramatic, but it really just comes as a fourth wall break out of nowhere, especially in the grand finale of the game. In any case, Kain doesn't take the mocking lying down, so he exclaims "Vae Victus" and charges into battle. Another fun discovery in that guide to Silicon Knights is their admission that Vae Victus is mispronounced. Oh, not really. It's only misspelled, and the error is in the U in Victus, which should be an I. As for pronunciation, it depends if it's classic Latin or medieval, and that's a rabbit hole I've gone down, but you don't have to and I won't subject you to it. You're welcome. What follows the cutscene is a rather hard boss fight, but in the end the creature is destroyed, and we come to the crux of the entire thing, the choice. Kain says he is the last pillar, and that at his whim the world is damned or redeemed. But nothing else in the game or in dialogue reveals this to Kain, except there could have been. There is a cut line of dialogue where Ariel would have said, "Yes, Kain, the Necromancer spoke truth. For Nosgoth to be restored, one more must die. You are the balance, Kain. Make your choice." Why this line was cut, I don't know. I mean, sure, Kain's dialogue and the two choices presented before us is enough for the player to realize what Mortanius really meant with one more. But in terms of the narrative, Kain's sudden realization is a bit odd.
After all, it's not like he's seeing the two cards the player sees. Now, if you choose to restore Nosgoth, Ariel gives a quick speech on how in life he was unknown, just a minor lord, but in death became so much more. But let's face it, we're all here for the really interesting bit, which is the bad ending. For Nosgoth, at least. Kain refuses the sacrifice and the pillars are destroyed. But why would he choose this? It's important to consider that at the beginning of the game, when the quest has just begun, Kain is looking to be free of the vampiric curse. He had hoped that after taking care of his killers, he'd be free and wants a cure. Ariel tells him that there is no cure for death, only release, and that is more or less what Kain is pursuing. So if he holds true to that desire, he picks the restoration option, fall on his sword, let the world heal. But on the other hand, he's been put through the ringer, and along the way realized he was the pawn of about 3 different games of 4D chess, be it Moebius, Mortanius, or even Hashakik, not to mention Ariel being complicit in it all. Everyone around him was playing him, and as he so boldly tells the Dark Entity, I served no one. He has more than enough reasons to deny them. If you'll allow me to once again peer beyond Blood Omen, into the events as relayed by future Kain in Soul Reaver 2, he mentions that him being the last vampire in Nosgoth was another factor, but truth be told, I don't think that crossed Blood Omen Kain's mind. This was a purely selfish choice, by a man that had been manipulated and expected to accept it and then end his own existence, after it had already been taken from him to put him on this path. In his place, would any of us be different? I'd love to say I would see the greater good, but I can't imagine what I would be feeling after the same revelations Kain had. Nothing good for sure. So Kain chooses to destroy the pillars, and in his indulgence after the fact, comes to see things in Vorador's point of view, which is a nice callback to him saying Vorador was a vision of what he would one day become. And with that ends Blood Omen, and I have to give them credit. The theming, the writing, and the narrative are great, even with the occasional hiccup or the Grand Guignol reference at the end. It's not perfect, but it's damn good. I hope you've enjoyed this in-depth look at the first title in the series. Next time we'll look at the first game in the Crystal Dynamics entries, which is Soul Reaver, at which point I'll no longer need to restrict myself in terms of speaking of wider series plot elements. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.